Silent Hill 2 is often regarded to be the best game in its franchise. It's often considered to be one of the best games to come from the 6th generation of gaming, and it's also considered to be one of the greatest horror games of all time. Silent Hill 2 is a game that's already had an overwhelming amount of discourse surrounding it. A simple scroll down the YouTube results shows that people have essentially covered every single aspect of this game that you can think of. No matter which way you look at it, this is a game that stirred up an overwhelming amount of conversation over the years. And it's unlikely that this video will add much more to the conversation, I'll be honest. That being said, Silent Hill 2 is a game that demands that you create and form your own perspective and come out of the experience with a certain message. And really, the game can only give you as much as you come into it with, if that makes sense. And that's why I think everyone's opinion of it matters. Mine, yours, and even the people that don't like the game. Because we all have something to say about Silent Hill 2, and the personal significance it has to us is special. And this is also why it's so hard to talk about this game to those who haven't played it yet. It's very easy to see this game as one with clunky controls, awful voice acting, and a fairly boring and uninteresting world. And yes, I do agree that those things are certainly things that hold the game back to a certain degree. However, they shouldn't stop you from being able to see the other things that the game does so well. Personally, Silent Hill 2 is one of my favorite horror games ever made. So much so that I ranked it at 4th place in my top 10 games of all time video. So, when I criticize this game, it truly does come from a place of love. So, we're gonna try and get into it all here, and go through the things that work and the things that don't. And don't worry if you haven't played the game yourself, since I'll do my best to take you through it. Obviously though, it is recommended that you play through the game yourself before watching this video, as we will get into spoilers later on. You may also notice that the runtime for this video is a lot shorter than my coverage of Silent Hill 1, and that's mainly because I'm changing up my style of writing a little bit this time around. I'll still be touching on everything I can, but hopefully it'll be in a more concise and enjoyable way for those that don't want to stick around for an hour-and-a-half video. So without further ado, let's just get straight into Silent Hill 2. The actual opening here is entirely different to what we had in Silent Hill 1. In that game, we were placed right into the thick of it with Harry needing to find his daughter Cheryl. Within minutes, we are put onto the streets of Silent Hill and exploring the town. Compare this to Silent Hill 2 and, well, it's a bit different. Instead of a father willing to put his life on the line to save his daughter, we're playing as someone staring at themselves in a dingy bathroom mirror. This is James Sunderland, our protagonist for this game, and instantly, we can tell that there is something different to him compared to Harry. James looks more timid and seems reluctant to actually begin his adventure into Silent Hill, until we finally get control of him and can explore the environment. Immediately, we are presented with a room that's leagues above what we got in Silent Hill 1. Silent Hill 2 is playing on an entirely different field. We're on the PS2 now, where 3D spaces have suddenly started to feel like real places. You can see all the disgusting details littered around the bathroom, from the grime on the floor to the posters on the wall. You can make out the vague and empty expression of James. Suddenly, everything looks just real enough to add an entirely different layer to the horror. The jump in visual quality from the first Silent Hill is kind of crazy if you think about it, especially when considering that there was only a 2-year gap between these two games. And when James finally leaves the bathroom, we are presented with our first shot of the town, and the crux of the game's plot. James is a widow, having lost his wife Mary to a disease 3 years ago. Except James recently got a letter from his wife telling him to meet her in Silent Hill.
In my restless dreams, I see that town, Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place.
The major question we have going into this is, how did Mary send James a letter when she's been dead for 3 years? And the letter is something that we can read from James's inventory, along with a picture of Mary from before she got ill. James's entire personality is so well defined just here in this monologue. He's quiet and clearly not having the best time right now.
It's ridiculous. Couldn't possibly be true. That's what I keep telling myself. A dead person can't write a letter. Mary died of that damn disease 3 years ago. So then, why am I looking for her?
And the most intriguing part of this is that we are assumedly in a post-Silent Hill 1 timeframe, where the town is still stuck in its fog-covered nightmare. Something that can be seen as we approach the town via the nearby forest trail. Yet none of this manages to make James rethink about any of this, since to him, there's nowhere else for him to go. The opening of this game is quiet, moody, and chock full of an atmosphere that's hard to describe. The soundscape here is especially good. With each step you hear the crunching of leaves and sticks, and the occasional sound in the distance alluding to something following you somewhere on the track. It's the perfect introduction to a horror game that uses its atmosphere to full effect. And it isn't long before we're introduced to another character in the form of Angela.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry. I
No,
was
it's
just...
okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
This entire cutscene just reinforces how sad James is, and how uncaring he is for his own personal well-being. You really get the sense that James has nothing left, and is betting that his wife is waiting for him somewhere in Silent Hill. And I think we all know that this isn't going to go the way he thinks it will. It's also worth noting that James's entire demeanor here is entirely different to the way he spoke in his monologue. Before, his voice has a much deeper tone, and it sounds like he's barely able to say the things that he is saying out loud. Whereas with Angela, his tone is much lighter, perhaps indicating that there are two sides to James that we haven't really seen yet. Either way, we now have to continue down the path into Silent Hill, and the game does something here that I absolutely love. Upon reaching the streets of Silent Hill, you may expect to see a monster or something out of the ordinary right off the bat, but once you actually get to the street and the town, nothing happens. No monsters, no dead bodies or blood, nothing. Once you work your way further into the town, we do get to see our first bit of blood and the vague shape of something walking into the fog, and following this trail does lead us to the first monster of the game. Which James savagely beats to death with a plank. This is also how we get our hands on the series' staple item, the radio, which lets us know when monsters are nearby, though we also get a message from someone that we can't quite make out. We now have free reign to explore the town for items and weapons and memos and all the good stuff that you expect to see. The size of Silent Hill is far smaller this time around in comparison to the first game, but this isn't really a bad thing since it makes exploring the town so much easier. Team Silent managed to condense Silent Hill down enough to the point where exploring it wasn't as much of a hassle. Also, rather incredibly, you can actually slot together the maps from Silent Hill 1 and 2 and get a much better idea of the size of the actual town. There's also something about this part of the town that makes it feel much older than it did in the first Silent Hill game. The streets seem dirtier, and the few places that we can enter are much more dilapidated in general. Neely's Bar is one of these locations, and this is where we get the infamous message on the wall about, the hole, and yeah, it's good. And this dirty, dingy aesthetic carries on into the game's first major dungeon, the Woodside Apartments. And the soundscape when you first enter this location is incredible. It's completely silent, to the point where you almost miss the overwhelming sounds of the monsters, radio, and general ambience. Dungeons in Silent Hill 2 tend to be on a much smaller scale than they were in the first game, but they take about as much time to progress through for the most part. These apartments manage to create an entirely different atmosphere to what we've been exposed to so far. Instead of open spaces and the ambience of the town, we're greeted to intensely claustrophobic and dead silent corridors. And then you have the apartment rooms themselves, which look dilapidated in every possible way. Each of these rooms are also very slightly different, making each one feel like they've got their own story and character. There's something so intensely simplistic about this entire area, and I think that's one of its biggest strengths. These rooms and corridors are so simple that they almost feel real. In fact, I remember growing up and walking down corridors that looked almost identical to this one. Even the sound that James makes as he walks along the musty carpets sounds really familiar to me. There are also various scares here which are set up perfectly, like the very first time you see the game's iconic monster Pyramid Head. Or the room where you see a dead man slumped in a chair in front of a TV. Progression here isn't too complicated, but does involve you going to specific places at different points to interact with different characters, like the little girl on the 3rd floor who steps on James's hand.
Ow! Hey, wait! Damn it.
Puzzles here aren't too bad either. We first have the clock puzzle, which simply requires us to move the hands to 10 past 9, and then we have a much more complicated puzzle in the form of the coin desk. Throughout the apartments there are coins to collect for this puzzle that requires you to place these coins in a certain order, dictated by a riddle you can find nearby. And I don't know if I'm especially stupid, but I have never been able to figure this out without some kind of guide. So if you did manage to figure this puzzle out on your own, on your first playthrough, you get a gold star. Anyway, solving that gets us a key, which lets us get into a room, and here's where I want to bring up something that I absolutely love about this game. Many of Silent Hill 2's background noises are actually randomized, whether that be another set of footprints, random crying, or even whispering right in your ear. Sometimes when entering this room in particular, you get the whispering. And it's almost always enough to make me shit myself just a little bit. But by doing this, we get another key which unlocks the final room and the game's first boss fight against Pyramid Head. And I'm going to be frank here, it's not really a boss fight and it kind of sucks. You're in this small room where there isn't much room to evade Pyramid Head's slow but very damaging attacks. The best part is, though, that you don't even need to shoot him. You can just run from corner to corner until he gets sleepy and leaves. And that's it. That's the first fight against Pyramid Head. Yeah, boss fights in this game are somehow worse than they were in the first game. Barely any of them have any interesting mechanics or anything that really looks like something a boss would do. The Woodside Apartments are a pretty good starting dungeon for the most part. It's small enough to not overwhelm you with places to go and search through. The scene where James reunites with Angela is also incredible and begins to hint at a few things that we'll see come back around later on. We also meet a new character here called Eddie, and the presentation is genuinely disgusting, with the sounds of him throwing up in the bathroom just next to a corpse poking out of the fridge. And Eddie's insistence that he didn't kill this man, when it's pretty clear that he did, hints at events that have happened to him as well. But now we're back on the streets of Silent Hill, and we bump into the little girl again. She mentions Mary, and James is obviously confused as to how she knew her. She really does not seem to like James though, and decides to run away. This leads us to Rosewater Park, where James was hoping Mary would be. And at first glance, he thinks he's found Mary, however this is actually a woman named Maria.
No, you're not.
Do I look like your girlfriend?
Maria's entire demeanor feels strange, and there's definitely something not right with her. But then you get flashes of her character that seem to be fairly normal, and she even has moments that are a little funny. After teasing him for a bit, Maria manages to convince James to let her tag along on the adventure of a lifetime as they both try to find his dead wife. And since she suggests trying the Lakeview Hotel, the two decide to make their way over to it, over on the other side of the lake. However, a dead end in the road stops them from getting too far. Luckily, there is a map next to a body that has the nearby bowling alley circled, so that's where we have to go next. And this will once again allow us to see Eddie and the little girl.
Laura, is that her name?
That's what she said.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
And the duo try to catch up with Laura to figure out how she knows about Mary. The problem is that Laura decided to walk into the giant, spooky, abandoned hospital. So now our next dungeon in the game is Brookhaven Hospital, and for all intents and purposes, this place is pretty tame. This area is going to suck if you aren't examining everything though. And I mean everything. There are some memos you can find that are easily missed if you aren't paying attention, which is something that happened a lot on my first playthrough. Brookhaven Hospital is an odd dungeon if only for the fact that you have Maria tagging along with you for a pretty big portion of it, resulting in a handful of mini jump scares as she just stands there staring at you whenever you enter a room.
Stop!
This doesn't last too long though, since she eventually starts to feel sick and needs to rest on one of the beds. And pay attention to this because this will come back around later on. So James now has to explore the rest of this hospital on his own. And boy, the atmosphere here is incredible. The dingy dark corridors offer up an entirely different ambience than what we've been exposed to so far. And it's also incredible how much power the sound of silence has. The atmosphere here is just extremely uncomfortable, and it's something that Team Silent really managed to nail. And they throw enough things at you in these areas to keep you on your toes, like how exploring on the roof results in Pyramid Head appearing out of nowhere, knocking you off the roof and down into a corridor on the 3rd floor. This area's main puzzle is the Louise puzzle, which requires you to find several keys and codes, which opens up a box that lets you find a piece of hair, which is very strange, I know. This piece of hair can be combined with a paperclip, which lets you fish out the elevator key from a drainage hole. Using this, James can access parts of the 1st floor that he hasn't been to yet, and this is where we can finally meet Laura once again.
I was friends with Mary. We met at the hospital. It was last year.
You liar! Laura,
Fine, don't believe me.
But last year, Mary was already...
The pieces clearly don't line up. Laura manages to lock James in one of the other hospital rooms, and this is where the next boss fight takes place, against the Flesh Lips, a strange mass of flesh twisted around the frame of a bed. Again, this boss fight isn't anything special, just keep shooting it and stay away from it, and you're good to go. Afterwards, a very weird scene plays out when you manage to kill them.
James. James. James.
Now, Brookhaven Hospital has transitioned to the other world, and the layout has slightly changed. If James goes back to the room where Maria was previously, she'll now be gone, and there are just a few medicine bottles next to the bed, leading James to wonder whether Maria is sick, just like Mary was. The other world functions much like it does in the first game, where it makes areas much darker, grimier, and more dangerous. Suitably, the other world version of Brookhaven Hospital is even more messed up than before, with the floors and walls covered in grime and many of the doors being sealed by disgusting looking tarp. There are also numerous sounds that start to play as you explore the place, like muffled breathing once you enter Maria's room. Proceeding down to the basement will reunite us with Maria, who is panicked and angry at James for leaving her behind. The two then continue to explore the hospital, and the coolest and weirdest thing happens when you enter the elevator. A goddamn quiz show suddenly starts up and asks you various questions about Silent Hill trivia, and this is genuinely incredible. Answering the questions correctly nets you a bunch of shotgun shells, so it is worth doing. Eventually, James and Maria find a hidden staircase on the 3rd floor that takes them down to a hidden wing of the hospital, where the hope is that it will eventually lead out of the other world, and then, out of nowhere, Pyramid Head comes barreling down the hall. This small sequence is amazing just for how surprising it is. And once you get to the elevator at the end of the hall, the doors close on Maria's arm, and she quickly gets killed by Pyramid Head. Leaving James alone once again. It's fair to say that James is at a pretty low point at the moment, having just lost one of the most helpful characters in the game, and it isn't clear where we should actually be going next, but after heading over to one of the offices in the hospital, it will give us our next clue. There's a map on the table here that tells us to go to Lindsay Street to find a letter and a wrench. We also see Laura walking past the window, but James really does not seem to care about her at this point. So this is the big backtracking section of the game where we have to go back to the first area, and it's interesting how little time you actually spend on Silent Hill streets in this game, especially in comparison to Silent Hill 1, though it could be that the town was too big for its own good in the first game, since a lot of time was allotted to running down long streets. Here the town is far more condensed and walking through it doesn't take long at all. It also helps that this section introduces shortcuts you can take that get you to Lindsay Street much quicker. There isn't much to say about this section though, to be honest. There are a few cool things here and there though, like the letter that you grab on Lindsay Street mentioning James directly, alluding to the fact that none of this is really real, an extra message on the wall in Neely's bar. There's also the fact that it's pitch black, which isn't really a big deal because it offers about the same amount of visibility as before. But it's spookier, so it feels cool. But anyway, we grab what we need off the street, which tells us to head over to Rosewater Park again to find a key buried in the ground. And now we're off to the Historical Society, which is perhaps the trippiest part of this entire game. Initially, everything seems pretty normal and along the lines of what you'd expect from a small museum. There are a few strange things though, like this painting of Pyramid Head on the wall. And then we have the staircase. That's right, if you're a fan of the ladder from MGS3, then we've got something here for you too. However, instead of a subtle version of the game's main theme, you get boat noises. Which I love equally. And after we've walked all the way down the staircase, we open the door and find ourselves in some kind of prison. And most of the logs and memos you can find lying around the place are from the 1800s, so it's safe to say this place is in a pretty bad state. It gets even weirder though, as massive holes appear in some of the rooms. James being James, he decides to jump down them without a second thought. And after doing that a few more times, we reunite with Eddie. Eddie seems to really have lost it at this point though, after apparently killing someone because they were laughing at him. And if we analyze the body, we find out that Eddie actually shot them multiple times, indicating that he may be a little more violent than we first thought. And now we're in Toluca Prison, which is perhaps the scariest area of the game, as it's where the game tries to fuck with you the most. In fact, this area has one of the best moments in the game that you can entirely miss if you don't notice it. There are a couple of cells that have invisible enemies. They don't attack and they really don't do anything, but walking past their cells can make James look up at something, as if he can see something you can't. Occasionally, the enemy says the word ritual in a very dark voice, and then, if you shoot it, you get an entirely unique sound that no other enemy in the game has. It's just such a weird but cool detail, and the fact that we can't see it, but James assumedly can? I love it. There's even a few cells that reference some of the occultist stuff from the first game, where many of the same sort of symbols can be seen drawn all over the walls. And the way to escape this area may not seem obvious for a little while, because it's pretty ingenious. There's a hatch we can find that doesn't have any handle, but by finding a wax doll, a lighter, and a horseshoe, James can solve that problem. Though whether or not this would actually work, that's up for debate. This then leads to a morgue where a couple dozen corpses can be seen, along with one of the best interaction lines I've seen so far. We're heading even further down now, and eventually come to corridors that look like regular corridors? They're really just plain rooms, and somehow the game manages to make even this feel uncomfortable. It's clear at this point that James is losing his mind, and experiencing things that aren't exactly normal. You could even read into this area as being a reflection of James's own subconscious, but we'll get into that a little later on. There isn't much in the way of puzzles here, except for one involving a spinning cube that changes the orientation of the following room. While it's a pretty small puzzle, it is fun and helps to add a slight bit of variety to the area. This also leads into one of the game's most iconic scenes, where we see Maria once again sat behind bars.
James, honey, did something happen to you? After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else?
Except now, she's acting very strangely. even to the point where her entire demeanor changes as soon as Mary's name is mentioned.
You said you took everything, but you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
And now the goal is to reunite with Maria on the other side of the bars, and there's quite a lot to get through before that even happens. Eventually, James comes across a newspaper article that talks about the death of someone named Thomas, and if you line the pieces up from throughout the game, you realize that the article is actually talking about Angela's father. And from the bits and pieces we can glean from this article, it seems that Angela had killed him and ran away from home. And well, let's just say that the next encounter seems to confirm something fairly harrowing. Running along the next corridor, you can hear Angela scream from one of the rooms, and as we enter, we can see one of the most disturbing enemies in the game, the Abstract Daddy. This monster symbolizes Angela's father and the abuse that he had done to her, and it's also the first case of James being able to see a monster from someone else's interpretation of Silent Hill. The boss fight's fine. Once again, you just do what you've been doing throughout the entire game already and shoot it until it's dead. And this results in one of the more disturbingly sad scenes in the game where Angela breaks down and starts accusing James of certain things. This is perhaps one of the most messed up scenes of the entire game, and the more you look into why this is the case, the more fucked up it becomes. It paints a picture of long-term abuse that Angela was a victim of, and her journey to Silent Hill was to confront that in some way. Ultimately, it makes Angela one of the most tragic characters in the entire game. Next up, we have another puzzle, and it's one that can be a little confusing if you don't pick up on it right away. In one room, there are 6 bodies hanging by the neck, and interacting with each of them reveals a different crime that led to their death. In another room, you can find 6 nooses that are laid out in the exact same way, but with no bodies in sight, and on the wall is a poem that goes on to list each of the crimes and the reasons for the criminals' deaths. The catch is that you need to figure out which of these criminals is actually innocent, and then you have to pull on the corresponding noose. The wording on the poem can be a little confusing, but the key is to focus on whether a suspect was confirmed and caught in the act. And the only suspect that this isn't true for is the arsonist, since the sheriff of the town had no evidence that they were guilty. Solving this riddle nets you the key to proceed into the next area where we are reunited with Maria. The catch is, she's already dead by the time we get to her, repeating the cycle of her dying and with James being unable to do anything about it. Now, this is the point in the game where something really doesn't feel right, and it's all building up to something that isn't too far away now. The game isn't exactly being subtle at this point though, since the next room you find resembles a graveyard. 3 graves in the corner are what we need to pay attention to here. The first saying Angela Orozco, the next saying Eddie Dombrowski, and the final one saying James Sunderland. And if the game wasn't any clearer with what it's trying to say, James has to jump down one final hole into his grave in order to progress. And it all culminates in another meeting with Eddie, who seems to have completely lost the plot, having killed a few more people in what seems to be some kind of meat locker. Eddie quickly turns on James, and we have yet another boss fight on our hands. Again, the boss fights in this game kind of suck. It is hilarious to see their ultimate duel play out like this though. It really does come down to shooting him a couple times and then healing some other times, and that's it. It really doesn't take too long though, and Eddie quickly meets his demise. It's also worth noting that this is the first human-on-human kill we've had in the series so far, and that's kind of impressive. After this though, there's one final stretch of the game left, the Lakeside Hotel. After a short section where James has to row across the lake, we finally reach the hotel, which is introduced via a rather imposing establishing shot. Upon entering, just on James's left, a map can be found with room 312 marked with the words "Waiting for you." It's ominous, but at this point, James can't really turn away from the opportunity to see his wife again. Progression here isn't too bad either, and doesn't take too long at all. The main things we need to find is a key to room 312, a videotape that Maria had mentioned in Labyrinth, and 3 music boxes that slot into the bigger music box, which will net us the final key. There's also a short scene where we meet Laura again. Here, she gives us a letter that Mary wrote to her, giving James some hope that Mary could indeed be here in the hotel somewhere. The design of the hotel is remarkably tame in comparison to the other locations that we've just been through, but that does have a point. After all, this has been James's goal all along, and it almost feels like the town is trying to give him a warm welcome. In terms of gameplay, the most interesting section here is when you need to use the elevator to access the lower floors. As soon as you step inside the elevator, the weight limit warning goes off. James then has to put all of his equipment in the nearby locker, and I mean everything, down to the radio and flashlight. James can't have any items, which definitely makes exploring these rooms feel a little more tense. Luckily, they don't throw enough enemies at you down here to make it annoying, or anything like that, but it's still a cool segment nonetheless. After we've gathered everything here, we can finally head up to room 312. James doesn't find Mary here though, just an empty room with a TV and a VCR. This is where the videotape comes into play and reveals the truth regarding Mary.
Are you taping again? Come on. I don't know why, but I just love it here. It's so peaceful. You know what I heard? This whole area used to be a sacred place. I think I can see why. It's too bad we have to leave. Please promise you'll take me again, James.
Yes, it was in fact James who killed Mary by smothering her with a pillow. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, there are unused sounds from this scene in the files of the game where you can hear Mary's muffled screaming, which I won't play here, but just know that this scene could have been even more harrowing. But yes, James killed his wife and repressed the memory of it. Mary didn't die 3 years ago. In fact, James had only killed her recently. Scenes later on in the hotel show that Mary was going through some tough times due to her terminal illness. She ultimately took out a lot of her frustrations out on James, who eventually grew to resent her. So, in a bid to end her pain and ultimately end the resentment he felt, James decided to smother her in her bed. This is where we can finally break down some of the symbolism shown throughout the game. Each of the monsters represents elements of James's subconscious, just like how the monsters in Silent Hill 1 were taken from Alessa's subconscious. The lying figure represents Mary, writhing in pain in a body they can't escape from. The mannequins represent James's frustration with his sexual desires and could represent his subconscious attitudes to women in general. Then we have the nurses, whose appearance is also dictated by James's sexual desires, though they also have aspects that represent the way in which Mary died, mostly seen in their detailless faces and the way that they writhe around after being shot, similar to the way that Mary died when she was being smothered. And then finally we have Pyramid Head, a monster that reflects James's need for punishment and represents all of his guilt and torment. And the connection that James and Pyramid Head has was actually going to be much clearer, as the great knife that the creature wields was originally half of a pair of scissors, and the great knife that James finds in the Labyrinth would have been the counterpart to Pyramid Head's own. A cool detail is that Pyramid Head doesn't have the great knife until James takes Angela's knife in the Woodside Apartments, further symbolizing James's need for punishment. So yeah, James isn't really a good person by most definitions, and what makes it worse is Laura, who stumbles into the room wondering where Mary is, because of course, she actually believes that Mary is somewhere in this town. James tells Laura the truth though, which understandably makes her upset and she runs away. James is then left alone in the room once again, until Mary's voice is heard on the radio asking him to find her.
Where are you? I'm waiting. I'm waiting for you. Please come to me.
Or is it Maria? It's here that we have to backtrack through the hotel, and we're greeted to a version of the hotel that looks like it's been caught in a fire, and that's actually because it has. The hotel burnt down sometime before Silent Hill 2 took place, though it's also symbolic of the fact that the idea of this place is now forever tarnished to James. This is no longer his or Mary's special place, it's just another burnt out building with echoes of a life brimming throughout its halls. We also get to meet Angela for one last time in a stairway caught on fire. It's heavily implied that Angela killed her father and brother here, or at least symbols of them, as two bodies are hanging on the wall next to her. If Silent Hill was trying to teach Eddie and Angela to somehow move on from their grief, the town did a terrible job. Eddie went even further down the rabbit hole and became a sadistic murderer, and Angela now thinks that that she has nothing else to live for. Unable to move on from the trauma of her past, she then leaves James behind and walks up the staircase and disappears behind the flames. All we have left to do now then is move forward, on to the next boss fight. James comes to a twisted version of the hotel's lobby and looks up to see Maria once again strapped to some kind of bed frame besides two pyramid heads. They proceed to kill her once again, making James break down before realizing that this is his punishment for what he did to Mary. This also reinforces the idea that Maria is Mary, or at least a projection conjured up by Silent Hill to guide James. In realizing this, he decides to stand up and face them head on, and face what he did to Mary on his own terms.
I was weak. That's why I needed you. Needed someone to punish me for my sins. But that's all over now. I know the truth. Now it's time to end this.
This boss fight is, as we've come to expect by now, pretty by the numbers, but it is interesting to have to deal with two pyramid heads instead of just one. Once James defeats the pyramid heads, they both walk to the center of the room and skewer themselves on their own spears. They aren't needed after all, since James is willing to come to terms with what he did. In the next room, we're greeted to a long corridor where we can hear Mary talking to James when he visited her one day. She starts off being antagonistic to James before quickly regretting it and wanting him to come back, showing just how strained their relationship was at the time of her illness, but ultimately proving that their love was still there. Now we have the final encounter of the game, which can change slightly depending on your actions. The most common person to find up here is Maria, dressed in Mary's clothing. If this happens, then James tells her that he doesn't need her anymore, which pisses Maria off ever so slightly.
You deserve to die too, James.
The boss fight here is similar to the Flesh Lips fight earlier in the hospital, only this time Maria has an attack that sends out a swarm of moths that stun James. The hunting rifle tends to make short work of the fight, and once it's done, all that's left to do is put one final bullet into Maria. This then cuts into the ending of the game, with James sitting beside Mary laying on a bed. The way that I interpret this scene is that Silent Hill has given James one last chance to speak to Mary, and this conversation will change depending on how you've played the game as well. If you've played the game normally, kept your health topped up, and listened to every optional conversation involving Mary, you're likely to get the leave ending, where Mary tells James to move on with his life and move forward. This then leads into Mary reading off the letter that James had at the start of the game, except James only read a portion of it, and not the whole thing. This is bookended with Laura and James leaving the graveyard together to start a new life. But this is an ending that I'm not the biggest fan of, if only because it doesn't really feel right to have a good and happy ending in a game like this. And I especially don't feel comfortable with James looking after Laura considering all of the game's events. Instead, I find that the in-water ending fits better thematically. You get this ending if you play the game at low health and do things like look at Angela's knife and looking at Mary's letter and photo a lot. Essentially, you have to play the game like James wants to die. It all plays out very similarly to Leave, except when Mary is trying to tell James to move on, she sadly dies before she can tell James anything meaningful, which then leads to James picking up Mary, putting her in his car, and then driving into the lake.
Now I understand the real reason I came to this town. I wonder, what was I afraid of? Without you, Mary, I've got nothing. Now, we can be together.
In doing this, he commits suicide, and the background for Mary's monologue is replaced with water. To me, I think this ending fits the best, and even though it's extremely upsetting to see it all end like this, I think it fits with James's character the most. Of course, there is also another ending. If you play the game and show a lot of care for Maria by interacting with her a lot and keeping her out of harm's way, you may fight Mary instead of Maria as the final boss. This representation of Mary is much more bitter towards James, ultimately leading to Mary transforming into the same monster that Maria turns into. After this, James returns to Rosewater Park, where he's reunited with Maria one last time, and the two decide to leave Silent Hill together. However, as they reach James's car, Maria begins to cough just like Mary did.
something about that cough.
The point of this ending is to show that James didn't really learn anything at all, and the cycle begins to repeat itself once again. And there's also the rebirth ending, which can only be acquired after a second playthrough. Here, James can find 4 occultist items that he thinks could bring Mary back to life. This ending is more of a reference to the shenanigans of the cult from Silent Hill 1, but it's interesting to see James go down this path instead of learning any sort of lesson from the town. And then we have 2 joke endings, with the UFO ending, where Harry Mason makes a cameo, and then there's the dog ending, one of the greatest secret endings in any game ever made. These are both hilarious and an awesome way to end your time in Silent Hill 2 on a much lighter note. And that's it. That's the end of Silent Hill 2. It's a game that definitely has its rough spots, mostly in terms of its boss encounters and rather simplistic level design, but those are things that always tend to stick out to me. And they are things that the game could have done much better, but those are rarely the things that people bring up whenever they talk about why this game is so special. Most of it comes down to the storyline, and the way in which small details are constantly in service to the overarching narrative. Silent Hill 2 is one of those experiences that can give you something new every time you come back to it, whether it's an aspect of the monster designs that you can read into, or simply a memo you can find in a dingy corner that gives some more context to the game's events. I also love the way that this game approaches horror. It's far slower than even the first Silent Hill when it comes to building up to some of the spookier stuff. And what you get here is a far tenser and more contemplative experience overall. From the slow walk into the town at the start of the game to the moody ambience throughout, Silent Hill 2 is a game that wants to take its time. The scares tend to all build up around the Toluca prison segment, which just so happens to be the point in the game where James has entirely lost the plot, before mellowing back out during the Lakeview Hotel segment, where the story returns to take center stage. Silent Hill 2 is ultimately about grief, and the ways in which we process it. It's also about the responsibility of our actions and whether the trauma that affects people is something that can be confronted and resolved. The stories of Eddie and Angela are tragedies in their own right, and there's certainly a lot to delve into there that I'm not going to get into here. And James's story is even more complex, with its final footnote depending on the way you got him through the game. I think it says a lot that simple gameplay decisions can truly affect James so much, to the point where he's either able to move on entirely, or doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over. At the start of the video, I mentioned how Silent Hill 2 can only give you so much, depending on what you go into it with, and I still feel like that's very true. It's not an easy or enjoyable experience by most metrics, but what is here is incredible, depending on what you take away from it. And its messages are ones that can differ from person to person, which makes discussions about the game so interesting. There are absolutely rough spots here, and I think we can all agree with that. From some gameplay choices to the voice acting, yada yada, you know how it goes, but all of it is in service to the greater narrative, which remains to be, in my opinion, one of the greatest ever made in the horror genre.